Hello everyone and welcome to the next chapter. This is a very important part of photography and it's about perspective and composition. Most people talk about them separately, but I like to combine them because I feel like they walk hand in hand and are synonymous with a good photograph. You have to consider both and sometimes in a similar way. So this is perspective and composition. Enjoy. Firstly, we're going to talk about perspective. Now, what is perspective? Make sure that's in the right place. Perspective can be considered in two different ways with regards to photography. First is your point of view of a certain scene. Now, we have so many different point of views and so many different ways we react to different scenes. And quite often this is completely subjective. It's completely bound to the viewer and it can range with different people. A lot of people can look at the same scene and evoke different emotions, or the scene evokes different emotions on them. And then there's the way we look onto a scene, the angle we look onto it, and that can sometimes affect our point of view. So to an extent, as a photographer, we might have a certain amount of control of the point of view of our viewer if we can control our perspective and the angle we look onto our subject, because different angles give different levels of emphasis to your subject. So this is the way we get to control our subject's point of view to an extent. One of the most common mistakes in perspective is when your subject doesn't own the frame. Your subject might be really small in the frame or might take up the whole frame. But what these two different images have in common is that the subject owns the frame. And quite often, people don't engage in their subject's environment and therefore the subject doesn't own the frame. It's not as important in the frame as it should be. So getting a little closer or zooming in and making the subject a little bit bigger in the frame might fix your perspective, and now all of a sudden the leopard has become the most distinguishable and most important part of the frame. It owns the frame. So giving your subject ownership over the frame can change your viewer's point of view on your subject itself or the scene itself. And then there's focal length. Focal lengths do affect our perspective on a scene. Different focal lengths of lenses have different effects on our picture. For example, wide-angle lenses let in a lot more detail from a much wider scene. Zoom lenses will zoom up, cutting out certain details on the sides and zoom up closer to a subject, putting your viewer closer to the subject. It's not as simple as that because there's another effect these two types of lenses have on each other, wide and zoom lenses. A zoom lens compresses distance. By zooming in so narrowly, it will make faraway objects seem much closer, not only your subject but the background itself. So your background becomes closer to your subject, which means you've got to be careful what lens you use when you go into a scene. If the story you want to tell is linked to a certain perspective, let's explain further. If you're trying to tell the story about an elephant, the character that is the elephant is an important part of the story and nothing else. A zoom lens is really good and good in that situation, which means you can travel back and forth and use your zoom lens freely. But if you want to tell a story about the elephant and the environment that it's in, the Great Plains of the Masai Mara and the clouds above it, if you use a zoom lens, it'll compress the distance between that elephant and the clouds, making the clouds a little bit bigger, but allowing less clouds into the frame, allowing less grass into the frame, making them bigger, but allowing less of it, which means you take emphasis away from the elephant's environment. If the environment is important, a wide-angle lens is good because it lets the background fall away into the distance and the viewer can travel into that landscape. So it's very important to choose your lens wisely. The next thing we're going to look at is the actual angle you look at towards your subject. Do you look down on it? Do you look up at it? These make a big difference with perspective. It could be a small subject that you're looking down on, or a large subject that you're looking up at, or a large subject that you're just above and looking down at. All of these have a different perspective on your subject, which means your viewer's point of view on your subject is going to change accordingly. If you want to give emphasis to your subject, if you want to make it feel colossal and make it feel important, it is better to look up at your subject. This is one of the most common mistakes in photography, especially in wildlife. When someone is sitting on a Jeep and they want to get too close to their subject and they drive right up to a lion and they're shooting down at it on the grass, that feeling of looking down is felt by the viewer itself, the person who sees your image, whether it's yourself or someone else. And it takes away importance from the animal. You're looking down on it. And it also kills your depth of field, which makes the image quite flat. And there's often an easy way to fix this. It might just be distancing yourself from the animal, so you're looking more eye level at it, or finding a depression to park the Jeep in or stand in if you're in a place that you can walk, and getting a low angle on your subject. You might be lucky that it's on a hill, and in that case you're blessed with a nice low angle and you're looking up at your subject, and the feeling your viewer gets, the point of view they have, is that your subject is important, more important than them. It's about the subject and that story. So having a good angle, a good perspective on your subject has a very strong effect on the point of view your viewer will have on your subject too. And this is the same case when you're on foot. And sometimes it's a small fix, especially when you're shooting a subject that doesn't run away from you. Now, if it is a subject that runs away from you on foot, you shouldn't be on foot anyway. But if you're shooting a human subject, quite often people don't want to get uncomfortable. They stand and they shoot, and often they might be taller than their subject. And again, you get that downward angle, which means the viewer looks down on the subject, which means you take away the importance of your subject. So get on your knees and improve that angle, or lie down and improve that angle. But again, these are just guidelines. You might have a story that's linked to a particular perspective. Looking down, looking at eye level, looking up towards your subject, all of them have different feelings. If you want your subject to be looking down on you and the viewer looking up at your subject, it gives massive emphasis to the subject. It gives a feeling of importance to the subject. If it's at eye level, you're getting engaged with your subject. You and your subject are having a conversation. It's not about who's important and who's not important. It's just introducing you to a character in a very useful way. If you're looking down on your subject, it could be because your subject's in a desperate state, in a sad state. The world is looking down on them. The weight of the world, the weight of their circumstances is coming down on them. So a downward angle might suit that situation much, much better. So there's a place to use perspective for various intentions. You don't always have to be lower or at eye level to your subject. Different angles work for different stories. So keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out what perspective is best for your scene. Now we're going to look at composition. Now, like I said, perspective and composition for me work hand in hand. They're two things you're always going to consider because it's got to do with where you stand and what's in front of you, and how you align yourself with what's in front of you, or how you align your frame with what's in front of you. And now we're going to get into composition and exactly what that means. Composition refers to two things mainly. It refers to the edge of your frame, the shape of the edge of your frame, the edges. We call this the format. Usually your camera shoots in 2x3, and you can change that in camera, but very few people do. If they're going to crop and change the format or the shape of the image, they usually do it in post-processing. And then it's the physical elements within the frame. That's the picture planes, that's the background, the foreground, and obviously your subject or subjects. How you align them. That is composition. The edges of the format and the elements within the frame and how you align it. And it's very important. Personally saying, I think it's the most important thing in any photograph. It's the thing you've got to consider before anything else, even your camera settings themselves. And like I said, it's not just where you place the physical elements within the frame, but it's also the format of the picture. This is often disregarded these days as not important in composition. Just the 4:5 crop for Instagram will do. Drives me fucking crazy. Betraying the format of your picture is as severe as betraying the physical elements, as severe as betraying the settings in your camera, as severe as the worst crime against your photograph you can commit. It is so important, and different shapes of the photograph suit different pictures more. Like I said, in your camera shoots at 2x3 because 2x3 is the most versatile shape of a lens. It allows room for your subject to move into. It works for a central facing subject where there's a lot of symmetry. It works for a lot of different pictures, and you can use it on a number of different types of images with your subject in a number of different postures and in different positions. Even if you have more subject, 2x3 is the safest bet. And it's also really safe because from 2x3 you don't have to crop much to go to 16:9 or square shape or 1:1. You don't have to take away much and lose too much detail to go to any other of these compositions. That's why your camera shoots in that format. Speaking of 16:9, I think it's a very beautiful format. I don't get my camera to shoot in 16:9. If I want 16:9, I'll crop in post-processing. But it's beautiful for prints, a nice wide print. It allows a lot of room for your subject to move into. It also allows for landscapes in an image to show their true power. If there's a lot of horizontal movement, especially in landscapes or in your subject itself, if it's lying flat, if you're seeing a horizontal profile of it, 16:9 complements those horizontal energies very well, and I find it slightly better than 2x3. 1:1 or a square format is often used for central facing subjects that are looking right at you. There's a lot of balance all around the image. There's no more weight being thrown in this direction than that direction, and it's a very powerful and often overlooked format for introducing the viewer to a character in a very strong and a very clear manner. There's nothing else that's important. It's you and the warthog, it's you and the elephant, all about that singular character A 1x1, a square format is really good for this type of approach to photography. Now we're going to get into some simple guidelines of composition. We've spoken about the physical elements, we've spoken about the format, the shape of the photograph. Now we're going to look at some guidelines of how to place those elements in your frame. Now I'm going to do a long video and we're going to go deep into some very useful compositional guidelines. But for now, let's stick to the fundamentals and the basics and three of the most commonly used guidelines. The first is the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is the most commonly used guideline for composing. What it does is it divides the image into three different sections of equal size, vertically and horizontally. And in between those sections, obviously, lines between those sections will appear. And where those lines converge, those areas are called power points. And essentially, the rule of thirds suggests that if you put your subject, whether it's your face, the entire body of your subject, on those power points, or your story, if there's a leading line coming to your subject, it comes from one point to another to your subject, you've created a powerful composition. So that's the rule of thirds. It's very commonly used and it works most of the time. But please beware of the rule of thirds because it can trap people into always putting their subject on one of those PowerPoints and they can lose out on much more powerful compositions. But not only does the rule of thirds suggest where to put your subject in the frame, it also suggests how to divide your picture planes. Remember, we're talking about picture planes. Your subject divides your frame into picture planes. They hold your subject. If you have horizontal lines, horizontal picture planes, if you can, possibly. Now, quite often you can't do this, especially in shooting in wildlife. You're not always graced with easy picture planes to align according to the rule of thirds. But where you can, if you can put your sky in 1/3 and your midground in 1/3 and your foreground in another third, according to the rule of thirds, that's a great composition. Or could be the sky at 2/3 and the ground 1/3, or 2/3 the ground and 2/3 the sky. You get the point. Dividing your picture planes according to the rule of thirds can make a very strong composition. If you can do the picture planes as well as put your subject on a PowerPoint, then you've got an extremely powerful composition. Be careful, it's just a guideline and it doesn't work for every image. And now we're going to look at a different composition guideline. And personally, this is my favorite way of composing an image. I find sometimes that the rule of thirds leaves a little bit too much space for the animal to move into, a little bit too much space on one side of the frame, and I feel that it's a little bit imbalanced in that direction. So personally, I feel that subject needs to move a little bit more into the center to help balance that out. This is where the phi grid comes in. I find myself using this guideline much more than the others. And what it does is bring your subject slightly close to the center, quite similar to the rule of thirds where you place your subject on these converging points. These ones are slightly close to the center. And personally, I think it holds a little bit more energy in the center of the frame, which is a style that I like. Some photographers like lots of space on one side of the frame, they use the rule of thirds. I like to bring that energy a little bit further in. So the phi grid's a very useful guideline for composing. It doesn't really work with picture planes and is more about positioning your physical elements within the frame. But consider it, because I feel that unless a subject is completely broadside and sending a lot of weight in a particular direction, if it's more facing you or at an angle, I believe the phi grid is a better way of positioning your subject. Now we're going to look at the Fibonacci spiral. Fancy word, Fibonacci spiral. This is quite an old method of composing and is a little bit harder to use because to get your physical elements to align perfectly with the spiral is actually quite difficult. It's more a guideline of direction in your image and is often used in portraiture. The best way to use it is how to position your eyes in portraiture and where the rest of the body should follow. For example, the eyes in this part of the frame and the spiral comes down the shoulder, along the arm and to the hand. The story follows the spiral. It's a really powerful way of composing, but it's very seldom used these days because it's very difficult in a scene to look at it and go, I'm going to apply the Fibonacci spiral here. Quite often we see it later and in post-processing. And quite often our elements don't exactly line up with the spiral. It's a very vague guideline. So that's perspective and composition. How to manipulate your point of view in an image using your angle at which you look onto it, whether you're looking up or looking down, and how those angles suit different images. And that's composition, the shape of your image, why that matters and why it suits different scenes, and the physical elements within that scene and how to align them. Like I said, composition is a vast subject, and we're going to go into depth on how to truly get the best composition out of your scene. But that's the fundamentals. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you for the next one. Cheers.